We're not trying to too. Next. Then me, yeah, next. So first off, really, I kind of wanted to get a sense of what you guys think some audit concerns are. So in the chat, please go ahead and put in some of your, like, your top 5, number 1, whatever. And then the room, just kind of think of some and holler them out. Just kind of curious what you all think we should be concerned about. And Julie will holler out as she gets some in the chat.
Okay. Effort certifications, reopening eCert.
Spent funds.
What cost transfers?
What capacity of unspent funds? Like at the beginning, at the end.
Did you hear cost
Yeah.
transfers?
Yeah, thank you, Julie.
Mhm.
Else? Oh, easy. Next slide, please. So based on some audit findings and kind of the research administration community, the most common audit findings are unallowable expenses, inappropriate applied indirect, so the indirect not being not the right rate, being charged when it shouldn't be charged, those kind of things. Inadequately supported expenses, so no backup documentation, nothing to really talk about why this expense should even be on the project. And then non-compliance with our own policies or procedures. So those are kind of the big normal common findings. There's obviously way more than just these 4, but these are kind of the top ones. So next slide. Easy items for auditors. You guys have mentioned some of these already. So effort, late certifications, reducing effort by more than 25%. How many in the room and then online, raise your virtual hands too. How many know that you need prior approval to reduce a PI's effort by 25% than what was budgeted? Okay, we have 1 in the room. The virtual hands.
We have at least 1. I can't see, but we have 1.
Okay.
I'm sure there's more.
So I think that's one that's really commonly overlooked, that if you're gonna, if a PI is gonna reduce their effort. So let's say they tell the sponsor they're gonna work for a month on the project. Something comes up, they want to use that money for something else. So now they're only gonna charge 50% of half a month to the project. That's a reduction of more than 25%. We need prior approval for that before they can do that. Going over doesn't need prior approval depending on the sponsor. It's just the reduction. So if that's the case, if you're talking to your PI and you realize what their plans are, reach out to sponsor programs to get that prior approval submitted.
And that holds true with every sponsor type.
It's federally, yes. Non-federal, different rules, but CSU applies federal rules. So all of our sponsored projects are consistent. And that falls back into following our own policies and procedures. It can be an audit finding. So this is one of our policy, it's not a policy because CSU doesn't really do policies, but one of our processes. So I have a hard time, I call it a policy. But
Question, that's if they dip below what was in the budget justification, correct?
Yes. Yep. And it's very common for a PI to budget, a month to 2 months of their salary just to hold that salary because they know they're going to spend it somewhere else. Put in a to be determined person if that's the intent of the money, because really the sponsor is looking at the PI said that they are going to commit this much effort and it's being awarded because the PI said they're going to commit this much effort. So it's totally okay to say what their effort really is going to be and then just add that extra to be determined line for knowing that they're going to hire somebody else in to help with the effort. We just need to be transparent to the funding agencies about who's going to do what effort. So, excessive cost transfers. So again, we talked about, we had cost transfers come out multiple ways from the group. Cost transfers in general, but excessive as well. So, does your unit or a unit, consistently put everything on a department account and move it later just because it's easier to figure it out after the fact? That would be excessive. Excessive is a relative term, so everyone has a different interpretation of that, but the auditors are going to have their interpretation. So minimizing cost transfers.
I have another question.
Yes.
So she wants to know if is it allowed during the academic year?
Is what allowed during the academic year. Salary or salary reduction? We can get
I
more
think the
clarification.
salary reduction is what I'm thinking.
Okay, we can get more
She
clarification.
says effort.
Okay, effort is allowed during the academic year. It should be charged when the effort is actually incurred. You'll have to, each department will need to work, you need to work with your own departments. Every department kind of has this different process for that. Because if you're a faculty member on a 9-month appointment and now you're moving part of that to a 5-3, where does that extra money go? Every department's different on what happens with that extra money. But effort should be charged when effort is incurred. Or when effort is, yeah, anyway. Y'all can get that. Costs incurred near the end of the project. So this one really, or does it look like you're restocking? You know, did you like have money left and you're like, oh, well, I know we'll use gloves for the next 3 years. So we're going to buy in bulk because it's cheaper to buy in bulk. That's restocking. That's not, it doesn't benefit the project at all. Do the items, yeah.
So I have a PI that has a project that is specifically for equipment.
Mhm.
So no personnel, nothing else budgeted on that. Well, I mean, he obviously has to purchase equipment through the entire project, but at what point would I begin to think,
Yeah, so it's really gonna depend on the scope of work. Equipment in general, you know, it's harder when that's the sole purpose of the award is the equipment. But in general, equipment needs to be purchased towards the beginning because you're saying you need that to accomplish the work. Well, if you don't buy it until the last 2 days of the award, how are you saying that that's benefiting the project?
Yeah.
When it's just an equipment award and that's the full intent of the funding, gotta look at the scope of the work. And if it's really just to build it up and get it, and it's kind of, you're adding on pieces and expanding it through the life, that's okay. So that's the challenge with a lot of these is there's no one set answer on them because it really ties back to the scope of work. These are just kind of things to consider and that will raise flags. So the auditors will come in and say, why did you buy equipment the last 2 days of the award? They'll pull up the scope, read through it and be like, okay, got it. And they'll move on, but they will look at it. And again, are the items needed to complete the work? So if your deliverable needs this last thing at the very end to finish it, that's okay to be buying it at the last minute. But again, tie it back to the project and why it's needed at this late at the time. The next one is cookie cutter justifications. So there are units on campus that kind of have forms that are pre-filled out that kind of route before it even gets into KFS. Well, those have suggested justifications. Those end up getting on the document as a copy paste. They are cookie cutter justifications because it doesn't really explain explicitly what happened with this thing or this product. So really make sure all your justifications tie back to the project and to the benefit of the project. So that in 5 years, when none of us are here, the auditors can look at that and go, yep, totally understand. And then we all just move on. I don't know about all of you, but there's been a lot of turnover on campus the past couple of years. And we're looking at old stuff right now going, what? And that's hard from an auditor's perspective and nobody's here anymore with the institutional memory. So just keep that in mind that you know it makes sense today, but will it make sense to you in 5 years when somebody comes back and asks for it? That's the fun part about audits. They're never right away. They're always really far down the line. Prior approvals obtained. So again, did we ask before we made changes? And did we ask the right person? A lot of agencies have your scientific person and then your kind of administrative person. We need permission from the administrative person, not the science person. So if you work with sponsored programs to obtain prior approval, we'll make sure we get it from the correct person. And we have shown auditors that the science person said it's okay. They're like, yep, that's great, but they don't have the authority to do that. So we need to make sure we're getting prior approval from the correct person. Insufficient documentation. So really think about who, what, where, when, why, how. You know, when you're answering your questions. Why are we getting it? Who is it benefiting it? What's the time frame of the purchase and is it within the scope of work? And actually, while we're talking about that, I'm going to actually kind of step back and just do a kind of overarching concept really quick. Most projects have a project period and a budget period. Often they are the same. Often they are not the same. So sometimes we'll get permission for only year 1 of a project. So the project period is 5 years, but we only have permission to spend in 1 year. So the expense has to occur within that budget period, not within the project period. So they are, if you're looking in RPS and our systems, you will see the two sets of dates. There's the obligation date and the project date. So your obligation date is what we're actually have permission to spend, and that's the budget period. Anything outside of that, we do not have permission to spend during those times. All right, participant support costs. Again, did we receive prior approval for rebudgeting? Those are very protected funds, especially in the federal world. Non-feds protect them, but it just doesn't feel quite safe. But the feds are very protective of those funds. So if you want to use it for anything else, prior approval is required. And then make sure that the participant support funds are never used for any employee expense. So let's say you're going to have a meal for your participants at a conference or whatever. The employee's meal needs to be charged to non-participant funds. So you'll need to pull that piece out and charge it to another place. It often is very hard to do that. I get that. As a conference, you pay an X for a conference and they don't break it down per person, but you need to do your best to pull out any employee out of that so that it does not charge the participant support funds. Okay, next, unreasonable allocation methods or not following the allocation method. So if something's benefiting multiple projects, let's just use two for simplicity's sake, and you say in your justification that it's based on FTE of personnel working, they're going to do the math to figure out that so-and-so was 70% FTE and the other is 30%. Your expense is better matched 70 and 30, not 71 and 29, 70 and 30. So whatever allocation method you indicate is how you've decided how to split the costs, it better match that. CSU does not have a policy or process on allocation method. We leave that up to each department to determine what's the best method for that expense. So some institutions actually have a policy on what method they will always use, and CSU does not. So. And then finally, travel. I know you guys have heard this, and really, our travel office here does an amazing job keeping us compliant with this. So as long as you're following CSU travel policies, you should be fine. But I don't know about you guys, my former PIs weren't always the best at following CSU travel policies. So fly America, number one, fly America. And if you cannot fly America, you better have a justification and reason for it. Very robust justification. Cheaper is not a justification. So there are caveats there. It's in the travel office's policy and procedure manual on what, I think it's in the FBI, on what are the exemptions to fly America. So again, you call one of CSU's travel agents, they're going to ensure that we're in compliance with Fly America.
Can you explain Fly America?
Yes, the federal government requires that any use of federal funds follows this Fly America policy. It basically is that it needs to be United flag carrier. There's a list of United States flag carrier. There is a list on some website that gives you all of the airlines that could fly partnering. It's flying like a joint partnership flight, even though it may not be a Fly America airline. Like, pretty sure Lufthansa does not qualify as a Fly America airline, but they partner with United a lot. And since United is, we can fly Lufthansa in certain aspects. So again, that's why using the travel agent keeps us in compliance with that. Where I think we find the most challenges is when people are international doing puddle jumper hops, like small kind of in country. It's cheaper, it's more convenient to use a local carrier. It is not a reimbursable expense because of that. It is when it's the only airline. So, but again, this is that full justification. If there is truly no Fly America airline that will get you from A to B, that's okay, we can, but we have to have that fully justified and fully explained that there was no other airline. Again, CSU travel agents, authorized travel agents can help you with all those. So that's what Fly America is. It's a federal mandate that we use US flag carrier airlines.
How are other departments monitoring it?
Again, our CSU travel office does amazing. If you submit a reimbursement for a non-Fly America, they will require the justification. And if it does not line up with our needs, then they will not reimburse the expense. So, it's just nice to have our faculty and employees know that before they fly, so they're not out this money inadvertently. But our travel office does a great job keeping us compliant. And then when, the other piece for travel is when somebody is traveling for a project, they need to be supported on that project as well. So it's not uncommon to say, ooh, I have a graduate student who would be great at helping me co-present this project. They worked on the award 3 years ago or something like that. Well, then we go off and travel. That travel is not allowable on the 5-3 project because they are not currently staffed on that 5-3 project. So maybe, even if it's just for the week that they're in that travel status, make sure they are staffed on the project that they are traveling for during that same time period. They have to have demonstrated effort on the project during the presentation for their expenses to be allowable on the project. That, I think, is where we have a huge audit risk on campus. It's very hard to kind of keep track of all those moving parts. And oftentimes, I think that the administrative staff is not told all that information or has access to see all the different parts and put it together. So for me, that's one of our big risk areas. Yeah.
Would you is that true if, even if it's written into the paperwork, that collaborators may participate and be reimbursed for that? Should we recommend that our PIs include that language in everything that they do? Because we have several projects for our department that are located around the world. And we have collaborators that we work with around the world, and they're not necessarily CSU. They don't have a CSU ID.
Yep. This is only for CSU employees.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah.
Thank you.
So what if you have a parent account with multiple program account under program income accounts?
That's, yeah, that's actually okay
Because they're tied to the parent account.
for
Okay.
the award.
So applicable to me right now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm pretty sure you have like 6 programming.
Yeah.
Hanging out there.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, the award is holistic. At CSU, we break them into little parts and different 5-3s, but really just thinking of the award holistic. All right, next slide, finally. Be falling asleep already? Yeah. Okay. Just let me know if Andy falls asleep on me back.
We'll hear him fall and hit the ground.
All right, impacts of audit findings. So what can happen, when we have audit findings? One, we could have a corrective action plan. So we have to do something to fix it. Follow-up testing, oftentimes they will come back and test the same things again. So it's just not a bad thing. It's just one more invasive thing that we have to deal with. And as everybody, no one wants, like the IRS contacts you. You want to just be one and done. Kind of how we feel about audits too. One and done. We don't want them going back. Increased scrutiny. We just are on their list. And so they're just kind of triple checking everything that we do. Oftentimes we have to disclose to all of our other sponsors depending on what the finding is. So, you know, let's say NSF comes in with a finding. Well, now we got to go tell all of our other Fed partners that we have this finding. And so now we're on everybody's list, which is not the lists we want to be on. Reimbursement of costs. If there are unallowable costs that have been determined, we have to pay those back. Fines. When I'm talking actual reimbursement of costs now, we could actually be fined for these findings. This side, the right side, is kind of more of the really bad stuff, but the federal government can take legal action against CSU, depending on what the finding is, or the individual, depending on, again, what the finding is. Impact CSU's reputation. I don't know how many of you heard Meg's conversation earlier, but you know, this whole federal relations with working, getting CSU out there, getting them in front of the feds and really getting us well known and respected with the feds. These audit findings can ruin that reputation pretty quickly. And then impact on future funding. So depending on what the finding is, they could prohibit CSU from getting funding from an agency for X number of years. So really one thing to really consider and think about is that the funding is provided to CSU. The funding is not provided to PIA or PIB. The funding is to CSU. So if there is an audit finding because somebody didn't do their job in Department Q, we are all impacted by that and everyone's funding is at jeopardy. So really I want to just point out, if you see something, say something. Just because it's not your department, but if a document comes through, you're like, this doesn't feel right, let somebody know. And I didn't write this down, but I should, and it should have been on the last slide, I apologize. There is a safe, kind of like the safe to tell for research misconduct or what you consider as maybe misappropriate use of funds. So you can share that confidentially if you see something, or you can reach out. I mean, it's everyone's comfort level, but if you're like very uncomfortable with that, please make sure you let somebody know, because it's easier for us to handle it internally than for the feds.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
Regarding travel during an internal federal audit, we were told they wanted to evidence the PIs know who's traveling on their grants. And they said now we ad hoc the PI for approval to show that.
Yeah. And that's not part of our normal process, but it can definitely be included, especially on the grants and projects that are cross campus and just, there can be a disconnect. So it is helpful. The other thing, and I think I was gonna get distracted, but I do get to it. So, all right, we'll move on. Next up. I'm gonna go through some actual NSF audit reports. These are actually from last quarter's NSF. They submit a quarterly report to Congress on what their findings were and what they've seen. So we're gonna actually go through some of those from the last quarter's report. So these are all gonna be NSF. NSFs are just nicer. They're much easier to read, but most federal agencies actually use NSF as kind of their guide and method for what they're looking for in audits. So NIH really relies on kind of how NSF does audits, on how they do audits, and so do other federal agencies. So again, NSF focused, but it really does kind of capture what all the federal agencies would do. They're just easier to read. Okay. First one. I know this is probably really hard to read, and I apologize, but I do think the slides were provided here. Okay, slides will be provided, so you can blow it up so you can actually read it. So number one was unallowable expenses. This one was fun. They bought kayak, canoe, and paddleboard rentals for participants to use during. See, that was my face too. For those of you on the owl, we have a jaw drop happening. But yeah, that was my, so they used it for participants to use during free time at a conference. Unallowable expense, just in case anyone was curious. What I love about this one is, again, these are reports that just came out from last quarter. This isn't 20 years ago before we all knew all this stuff. This is from last quarter's reports. So it's still happening, even though I feel like we talk about it all the time when we kind of go through this stuff. It's still happening. So this is, these paddleboards are considered entertainment costs. And entertainment costs are generally unallowable. The other unallowable expense was that publications did not reference NSF support. So they paid for the publication off the NSF award, but did not reference the NSF award in their acknowledgements. So NSF came back and deemed it an unallowable expense. I know I never checked my PI's publications, so just remind your PIs that if they use the award to pay for the publication, make sure they reference the publication as supporting this work. And then another one was that a student dropped the required minor. So there was, students were getting stipends for participating, but they needed to have a minor, the specific minor. The student dropped it, the unit did not go back and pull back that stipend from the student for not completing their requirement, basically. So that was a deemed and unallowable cost. You can see none of these are huge. So materiality doesn't matter. The paddle boards were $98. I mean, at this point, I might just write them a check for $100 to just move on. But now this university is under scrutiny for a $98 charge. So materiality does not matter in these. Number two, the indirect costs were inappropriately applied. So again, in this specific case, they had all of the expenses charged under a participant support kind of thing, even for employees. So IDC was not charged on the employee portion of the expense. So it's inappropriately applied IDC. CSU has them in two separate accounts. So as long as you keep them separate into the two accounts, IDC will be charged appropriately. Inadequately supported expenses. There were no itemized receipts. So I know you guys hear it from pretty much BFS and, everybody, we need an itemized receipt. And this is why, because without the itemized receipt, we cannot demonstrate to the feds what was actually purchased and that it was reasonable cost. Yes.
One thing that I've noticed, I'm a travel arranger for our department. One thing I've noticed is that because of personal security and information requests from people at large, a lot of our vendors are no longer including itemization, the credit card information, who the holder is, that kind of thing. Do you have any recommendations as to how we can backfill that in order to meet the documentation requirements?
And what kind of expense are we talking about?
Oh, gosh, travel expenses, especially, so like
Meals?
Uber, Lyft, meals definitely, but restaurants are no longer providing that information. I'm finding really anything.
Okay. No, I don't have a good story.
Okay.
Really, I think it's hard because we have to show what the cost was at the time and what they got for that cost.
And it's been a real headache.
Yeah,
And, with SOP, it's like even more so because we don't want to have an audit finding.
right. I haven't traveled, Lyft or Uber lately, so I haven't seen the
Yeah.
receipts, but there should be an expense. I mean,
Even and the interesting thing is we're even finding it from like the banks, when students go in to take snapshots, they'll send it to it and it'll have the bank name and the amount and the date, and that is it, nothing else. No, yeah, so it's a nightmare.
yeah,
It's developing.
I don't have an answer,
Okay.
but if it continues to be a problem, I know travel will reach out to me
Right,
if we run into a lot of issues, because travel's gonna have to update their
Mhm.
process and stuff, so
Yeah,
that is a challenge. This finding specifically was actually for our consultant.
Mm.
I mean, it doesn't really, it's
Right.
itemized receipts, but the consultant was just X dollars for so-and-so to do work.
and we push back on those kind of things.
Yeah,
So that we do have that documentation in place. It's just the larger, bigger companies.
right. Yeah, I'm gonna think on that one, actually, so maybe it'll resolve itself, and I don't have to think about it anymore.
Hopefully,
But, something like you're at a restaurant, you take a picture of the menu that shows that you've had X and,
mhm.
it's in that ballpark.
Yeah, so
But-
we're starting to see just patron 1, patron 2 with just the expense.
Yeah, and that's gonna be challenging because alcohol is prohibited in federal courts. And
Yep.
So that's the big thing at restaurants.
Yep.
Okay. I don't need any more problems today.
Sorry to bring that.
No, I do think about it, and I'll leave it
Right.
to travel and see how. As it
So
gets
what we've
worse.
been doing is it doesn't really answer the documentation question. We've been showing the incursion of cost by requesting statements or for the card that's used, but that doesn't help because it's a line item to the vendor, not the itemization.
Yeah, and sometimes that's the best we can do, but really that effort of trying is often our documentation. We can't control.
Mhm. And we do attach
Supplier.
all of those conversations as long as those pages get. So.
Yeah. Okay, so much fun. Let's move on.
Yeah.
Let's see, number 4, non-compliance with federal requirements for pass-through entities. Pass-through entities are subawards. This one it's sponsored programs, really. Truly, deeply, probably not for you guys, but just as an awareness. This finding was because they didn't do a risk assessment of their subawards before issuing this up. Stared at you, she's like, I know. So, the Office of Sponsored Programs takes on that role of assessing, doing the risk assessment before we issue a subaward. Really, I wanted to bring that to your attention because I know there can be a delay in getting subawards issued, and I'm sure everyone's like, what's going on? Why does this take so long? And it is because we have to do this risk assessment. We are federally obligated on any pass-through money that we do. We have to do this risk assessment and determine kind of what we need to feel compliant and comfortable with issuing a sub-award. So, and because it was part of their process and they didn't do it, they have a finding on that. And then the last one on this one is non-compliance with NSF terms and conditions. So this is really, really important just to understand the terms and conditions. This specific finding was on the Graduate Research for GRFP, Graduate Research Fellowship Program. And they have, the terms and conditions are very clear on what, like if a student starts mid-month, how you prorate the months and stuff. And so for that program, NSF is very clear. This institution prorated it by days, not by the way NSF laid it out. So there was a finding of some unallowable costs. Again, really understanding your terms and conditions. Once you get a copy of these slides, in the notes section of every slide is the actual link to the audit report for each of these if you want to go dig into even more. Because like they're kind of interesting. Okay, next one. We have 4 of these, so how are we doing on time? I can't read them. Okay. We'll bust through them a little bit quicker now that we've walked through one. This one's really hard to read. Number 1 is inadequate monitoring and inappropriate reporting of cost share. So the sub-award did not maintain sufficient documentation to support allowability of its expenditures. The sub reported that it met the cost share requirements prior to actually meeting the cost share requirements. So like with invoice 2, they said they met all the cost share requirements, and that's what they reported to the institution. But when the NSF came in and did the audit, they showed that there was no documentation or proof that they had actually met the cost share in that window. So turned out they did finally fully meet the cost share, but it wasn't when they reported to the institution that they met the cost share. The sub-award reported, there was another one, the sub-award reported that it had met the cost share when in fact it never did the cost share. So it just said, yep, we met it, but there was no documentation or anything to prove that they met it. And then the university used the same equipment expense as cost share on 2 different awards. So, you know, at CSU, we always pull out and make new accounts for cost share, and that is so that we can ensure it's only that dollar is only being used once for a cost share. So we don't ever get duplicate using the same dollar for multiple cost share commitments. Number 2, unallowable expenses. This group was budgeted as a consultant, but then the institution issued it as a sub award instead. There was no prior approval for that sub award, so it was deemed unallowable. So again, just make sure prior approval happens if you're going to change things. One of the subs issued another sub, so a tertiary sub, and again, there was no approval from NSF to do that. So that was deemed unallowable, even though that tertiary sub was doing the scope of work. Just it wasn't previously approved. And then furniture was purchased and it wasn't necessary or reasonable for the award. And then airline upgrade fees were charged to the award. So like in Economy Plus or something like that, it just, those aren't allowed. You can pay for those out of your own pocket, separate outside of CSU, but they're not allowable on the awards. Again, using our travel office, we'll make sure that everything stays okay for you. And number 3, indirect costs inappropriately applied. This university did an upgrade to their AV system. And so it actually, they bought supplies to upgrade their AV system, but the AV system is a capital equipment. So adding on to the functionality of capital equipment is capital equipment. So IDC indirect costs should not have been charged to those supplies. So again, if you have questions on that, work with the property office here at CSU. They're great at kind of working through those nuances and helping you figure out if you need to capitalize it or if it's capital or not. Okay, next slide.
So I have a question about cost sharing. Since it's so burdensome, why do we still continue with non-reportable cost share accounts?
And next slide. Hate that question. Yeah, it's extremely burdensome. We have a policy that says that we will have demonstrated effort on every award. And so if a PI does not have demonstrated effort on the actual award, then we have to create the cost share account to show that demonstrated effort, because it's a CSU policy. Again, we have to follow our policies and procedures. Who do I get a love later? You're gonna tell me this somehow. They know I love that.
She wants to know if anybody's revising the policy.
It's on my magic list to reevaluate the policy. How's that?
Wouldn't that be nice?
Magic list. I have a magic list. All right. Where are we at? Next one. Is this my next one? Why doesn't it look? All right. I feel like this, maybe my pages are out of order. This one's so hard to read. A lot of the similar stuff that we kind of talked about, inadequately supported expenses. The sub award couldn't document where their expenses came, how they came up with the amounts for their expenses. So this is, I think, the really important thing is like, this is not CSU. This is not CSU not documenting our expenses. This is, we've given this money to someone else and they're not documenting their expenses. We're now liable for it. It's CSU's finding. It is not our sub-awards finding. We're going to push it down and we're going to have them reimburse us for it. But at the end of the day, it's a CSU finding. It is not a sub-award finding. This is why we have to do those risk assessments. Submitted an invoice that didn't appear to tie to any actual costs. You know, why not? Sounds good. A recharge count could not demonstrate that they reviewed or adjusted their rates biannually, nor that the rates only covered the aggregate costs. Those are our 21 accounts. You have a 21 account, you know how much challenge they are, and it is exactly because of these rules that a recharge center can only cover their own costs, that they cannot make a profit from the federal government. So, and there's audit findings. They will go back and do all the math and figure that out. So again, campus services does a great job of keeping us in the best compliance that we can with our recharge centers. And then this one's kind of meal reimbursements were not based on per diem or receipts. I don't know how many times I've had a PI come back or a traveler come back and say, just give me $20. I don't want, you know, it's fine. It's all I need reimbursement or, you know, whatever. But there's no note saying that that's what the individual requested. So the per diem does not match, their reimbursement doesn't match per diem or receipt. So just make notes. If you're not using per diem or the receipt and the map, it doesn't, your reimbursement doesn't match up with either of those, just comment why. We're good to go. Yeah, I'm feeling really sensitive on time here because I got some other stuff, but expenses not appropriately allocated to NSF awards. I'm not going to go through all the specifics on here, but we have kind of talked about it. And this again is allocation. So they had some where a traveler went, presented at a conference, acknowledged 3 different awards at the conference, but only 1 award paid for the travel. That wasn't allocated appropriately. So there was no note, there was no justification, there was no explanation of why only 1 award was charged for the full expense with 3 awards were being presented on. So just really think about it and document it. If those other awards are done and they're finished and that's why you can't use them, then use department funds. Don't use 153 to support multiple projects on a travel. Really just that allocation again. They actually, so, you know, I was saying don't charge 51%, 49%. You allocate, you say it's going to be 50-50. They actually had a finding because they said it would be 70% charged to one project and the math came out as 71%. And it was a finding. So I'm not joking on the math, just double check your math. And then again, this is another where the subaward did something, but the university was liable for it. So the subaward did not classify something as capital equipment. And so they charged indirect. And then for whatever reason, let's just say CSU agreed that it wasn't capital equipment. And so charged indirect on the sub like normal. That's all an unallowable expense. The indirect was not charged appropriately. So we have to be monitoring our subs. OSP does a lot of this heavy lifting on that part, but it's also just being mindful that if you see something, again, if you see something or you're questioning a cost when you see those reimbursement claims come through from the subs, let us know and we can help dig into it, because I'd rather catch it then. And again, 5 years on the line when none of us are here and nobody at the sub institution is there. And let's just hope the sub institution still exists. All right, next slide. This should be the last one.
Can you list what's IDC exempt?
At CSU, let's see, fellowships, fellowship stipend payments. I feel like this is a pop quiz because I'm not going to get them all. Equipment, sub costs over 25,000.
Tuition?
Tuition. Let's see. Yeah, those are the big ones. Participant support costs. It's on our NICRA, it's on our federally negotiated indirect rate agreement. At the bottom, it says what's excluded. So, but I do feel like I was pop quiz and I failed. More unallowable costs. Basketball ticket. Another good one. So, this one we have actually, this is very common. It's issued. The next one is that they used participant support funds to pay a graduate student because the graduate student was helping in the lab with the participants. So it's actually fairly common that happens here. That is not allowable. So really think in the participant support accounts, there should never be an employment object code. That's one way to think about it. There should never be an employment object code.
And these are all from this NSF audit, right?
Yeah, these are all separate audits. Each page is a different university. So, and there are the links to each actual report on the PowerPoint. So they use participant support funds to pay for conference registration for an employee, and then 2 participants who did not attend. So one, the employee should have been on the non-participant support funds, and then if somebody didn't attend, we shouldn't have paid for the registration, and we should have sought reimbursement for that registration. And if we did not seek reimbursement, there should be a full justification reason of why they did not attend. You know, family emergency, totally get it, understand why they didn't attend, but they just forgot to show up or something like that. That's not okay. We need to move those funds to a non-federal source. Yeah, okay, we've covered most of these.
I wonder if some of that might have had to do with COVID and not being able to travel to a conference.
It's possible. The actual dates of the occurrence are in the actual report. I did not. And most of these tables, I just took one little snippet. Most of them are a couple pages long. These costs are not allowable. Inappropriately allocated expenses. This one, this is about insurance premiums that they pay for students. We actually have units on campus that bring students to campus for summer events. They have to pay extra insurance for those students while they're here. That's fine, and again, it's an allowable expense. The challenge with this is that the students were not reported in the annual report as being participants. So we have an insurance expense for the student, but they weren't part of the annual report. Please make sure any participant gets listed in your annual report. Otherwise, any expense related to them will not be allowable on the project. I don't know about you guys, but I was not checking my PI's annual reports either. So that happens a lot, and say 99% of the time it's not intentional. It's just when you get these large programs, you get a lot of participants, and making sure that they all get reported out. It just happens that we miss some, but it can lead to unallowable costs. And then finally on this one, airfare was charged to the project for the PI to go to a conference, but the conference was not listed in their annual report as part of their deliverables. So again, if you're gonna use the federal funds or the sponsors funds, make sure it's in the report that you did these things, that your deliverables or whatever. Okay. And next slide. Summary. Okay, next slide. Wrap it up.
The PIs do the annual report, right?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. And hopefully they're asking for administrative help to kind of capture all those. I don't know. My PIs never had like the full list. It was always me who had the full list. So hopefully they're asking for help. Expense allocation. One, just make sure that the costs are charged to the correct award when the expense is initially incurred. It's just better to get it right the first time, because what do you know in 3, 4, 5 months better than you knew when the expense actually happened? Answers to that. The cost is necessary for award performance. Like, it's not just because somebody wants a meal and so they're gonna have an event so they can have somebody else pay for their lunch or whatever. How does it benefit the project? And the costs are allocated appropriately. So again, if it's sharing against multiple projects, make sure to allocate it across multiple projects. And then costs are incurred timely during the period of performance. Make sure, like, I think what I see more on this one is like consultant invoices kind of come in oftentimes towards the end because they've been working through the whole project. They really should be invoicing consistently and throughout the life of the project as the work is incurred and not saving it to the end. And so kind of roles and responsibilities. So really the PI is responsible for sharing with you, or whoever made the purchase. That's probably better. I use the word PI, but it's like whoever made the purchase should tell you why they made the purchase and how it benefits the project. Graduate students often don't know. They were told that they needed X. So you have to peel it out of them and really help them. But it's best to get it done right then. But it really is the PI's responsibility to share that information with you all. The fiscal officer, make sure you support your document, provide the backup documentation, and that make sure your allocation method matches how the expenses were actually spread out. And then sponsored programs, we do monitor that expenses are allowable on the award. As y'all know, we do not approve every expense. So we do our best, but we are not seeing everything as it comes through. And then we ensure that cost transfers have the appropriate information to support the reallocation. Next slide, please. Expense supports. Itemized receipts. We just discussed that. That's becoming a challenge. Justification on how it benefits the project. Again, it's best to answer it at this exact moment because none of us are going to remember. Okay, honestly, I forget what I had for breakfast yesterday. So I probably won't remember tomorrow either what it was for. Definitely not going to remember 5 years when the auditors come. And then the expenses were incurred during the period of performance, more specifically during the budget period, the obligation period. So the PI really needs to provide the description, and then whoever made the purchase needs to provide the itemized receipt to the staff. And the fiscal officer needs to ensure the justification is attached to the expense record and that the itemized receipts are attached to the expense record. One thing to keep in mind, KFS is our financial system of record. When the auditors come, they often have full access to KFS. And so they do their own pulling of documents and stuff. So if everything's right there in that picture, they look, they're done, and we move on. If we have to go hunting for things or cross-reference to other documents, it's just opening up more and more and more for them to look at, which, you know, any sample size, the more things you look at, the more likely you are to find something. So really keep each document kind of as its unique whole story. It's kind of what I like to say. And that way when they come in, because they take a sample, and so they'll say document 265, whatever, and they'll just look at that. And if it's the whole story, they move on. But if you say it's a correction of document 362, they have to look at that one. Now they're going to go look at 362, which may or may not have gone through this full thought process, like the cost transfer did, because it happened years ago, or, you know, whatever. So think of it as your whole story. One thing I recommend for internal billings, because I know oftentimes there is no backup to internal billings. If you get a receipt like from Ramtech, attach that receipt to that internal billing for your account and add your justification at the time. Again, you're done then. It's a full picture on that document for your account. All right, next slide.
Oh, I have a question.
Yep.
What is OSP's recommendation for explanation for all the cost transfers we are doing with the delayed accounts being issued due to lack of staff?
Yep. So explaining why they're being done it's fine. So as long as they're moving from department account to the 5-3, we're not moving them between 5-3s. We have the record of when the account was created, when it actually started, so we can see that history. Yep. We're trying. So we don't have to, but we know that's okay. I mean, it's relatively okay. We prefer no, but it's just where we're at like right now. All right, prior approvals. If there's a change in key personnel, make sure that that is prior approved from the sponsor. Reduction in PI effort, we've talked about that 25%, but also it's a disengagement of more than 3 months. So oftentimes, maternity leave, the PI says they're going to keep checking in, and so they don't really deem that as a disengagement for 3 months. Really talk to them about that. One, we have maternity leave for a reason. They should be taking the time off. Spend with the baby and not having to worry about work. But I'd say most of our PIs are just so dedicated to everything they're doing that they don't want to disengage. But we really should be encouraging them to disengage and just letting the sponsor know. There's no problems with it. Their students can still get paid. We just need to inform the sponsor what's going on. So talk to us about it. Reallocation, rebudget of participant support funds, need prior approval. Adding a new subaward, kind of talk about the implications of that, and then a change in the scope of work. And again, the PI just needs to notify OSP or their department research administrator as soon as possible if they have any thoughts of one of these changes. I put this in as fiscal officer, but this may or may not be a fiscal officer responsibility. I just kind of a better title and it didn't fit the flow of everything else. But at some point, someone in the department needs to reach out to OSP if it's not the PI. So like the department research administrator, which is often the fiscal officer, but not always. Let us know. And then sponsored programs will submit those requests, those formal requests to the funding agency. Again, we'll make sure it gets to the right person and we get the right person's approval for it. At the very end of this presentation, when you get this, there is a link to a prior approval matrix. So it lists all the various agencies and kind of the different things that you might want to do and who requires prior approval and who doesn't. So it's a good resource to kind of just check like, oh, should I ask about this or not? And next slide. Participant support. It is only for participants. Only for participants. Stipends only, no salary or fringe object codes should be on there. No employee expenses are allowed. So again, I think the biggest challenge of this is when an employee is benefiting from something that you're already purchasing. So like a meal or event, you really do need to pull out that individual cost, charge it somewhere else. It is exempt from indirect and a prior approval is required for rebudgeting. So I'm gonna go back for a second. I think campus has, I think we're mostly got it figured out, but if you have a student who works in the dining center, and so they are an employee of CSU, but they're participating in a research experience over in engineering, you can pay them a stipend and that's okay. So they are an employee of CSU, but what they're doing for your project is not an employment thing. So I think we've got that pretty well figured out when you do the stipend form, that it can help you walk through that. But I know it can often be confusing because they truly are an employee. That is true for students. That is not necessarily true for like admin staff, state classified and faculty. It's a whole other can of worms. But for students. So. Roles and responsibilities. The PI again needs to understand terms and conditions. Work with sponsored programs if they need a request to change, and then notify their fiscal officer immediately if plans change. And kind of that one is getting at the fact that if they know a student has withdrawn from something, letting the fiscal officer know to stop payment on a stipend, anything like that, so that the fiscal officer can take an action if they need to. The fiscal officer also needs to understand the terms and conditions of what's allowable, what's not allowable, and ensure that only participant support costs are on the account, and then correct errors immediately when they're discovered. And then sponsored programs role, we will set up that separate account so we can pull off those funds, make sure they're protected with 0% indirect, and we will monitor object codes in those accounts as well to ensure that we're not seeing employment object codes or things that seem inappropriate. And I hope last up. There's a couple of resources. So one is the FDP prior approval matrix that I was just telling you about. And then our cost transfer guidance on our website. to make sure that you're really thinking through what needs to be included in each cost transfer. And that is it. And we have 1 minute for questions. You guys know where to find me too. I mean, I know I didn't give us enough time for questions, but feel free to reach out to me whenever you have questions. I'd rather work with you ahead of time to kind of figure out how to justify something or how to take care of it before you try to push it through or try to go ways. And when you're reaching out to Central, if you have questions on how to do something, please make sure to explain to them that it is going to be from sponsored project funds, if it is, because their answers will vary. So I think where I see a lot of the headaches for everybody. They're like, well, so-and-so told me to do it this way. It's like, well, yes, but you didn't tell them it was sponsored funds. It's a completely different story at that point.
I have one more question.
Yep.
When a project budget has ended, sorry, my screen flipped, but the project will continue, why are we asked to create at-risk forms? Sorry, my screen's covered up.
I think I know the rest of the question.
You probably do. To continue the work.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And that goes back to that project period and obligation period. So the reason why we asked that is because the project period, the obligation period has ended, but the project period is still going. We don't have the new approval or the new modification or the new agreement, whatever you want to call it, to say, yes, you can continue spending now past this date. And so that is why we ask for the at-risk, because we don't have the authority or the permission to keep spending. The agency has not given us that authority. So you really are in an at-risk phase at that point, because if the agency says, oh, we ran out of money for this program, I know we told you it was going to be another 5 years, but we don't have any more money, the department is out that money. And so that's why we do that. I know it's annoying and it's a pain, but really the obligation is all we have authority to spend, and that period is all we have authority for. But those 2 dates can get challenging, and why there's 2 sets of dates. So. All right, any other questions online, Julie?
I don't see any. Oh, even if there's money left on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what the balance is. You only have obligation to that date. So if you get in those scenarios too, where there is money left and you're waiting, because some agencies or some subawards can take forever to issue us the next year funding, request a no cost extension on that year 1. Because then it can give you the time, work with your sponsored programs office team to request a no cost extension on that year 1 funding. Or year 2 or whatever, so that you can keep spending while they finish everything else. And sometimes it's just enough push that they just finish what they needed to finish anyway. So. Yeah, people lurking outside.
Lurkers.
All right, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate coming today.